Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Knowledge Bank entitled Heat Network Essentials. Today's webinar is being presented by Jarrad Bedford, Insite Energy's Head of Sales. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please submit them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get through as many as possible at the end. The webinar is being recorded today and will be available to watch back via the News on the Block YouTube channel. I'm now going to hand you over to Jarrad to begin the session.
Thanks, Vicky. Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking some time to join me today. As you might have guessed from the title, we're going to go through Heat Network Essentials today. So this session really is sort of aimed at people who have limited experience of heat networks or are getting into heat networks for the first time. So it's a sort of light touch session on everything heat networks related. And by all means, if there's any questions at the end about anything more in depth about what we've discussed, you can let me know at the end. But I really do hope you find the session useful and informative. I try to keep things fairly engaging as best I can. Anyway, we progress. So agenda for today. The agenda is as follows. So firstly, I will try and set the scene a little bit and give some context about heat networks, why they're being rolled out and what even are they. Then we'll cover the three key contracts to understanding when it comes to management and operation of heat networks, and really just try and get our heads around the fundamentals of the key services involved, as well as best practice. And then I'll lightly touch on the regulations just to raise your awareness of what is potentially coming in the months and years to come. And then finally, I'll finish on some key takeaways, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for Q&As. If there are any questions at the end that we run out of time for, or I need to get back to you on, we can send these around after the session. So a little bit on me first. So I have over 10 years experience within the housing sector. I've worked over that time with social housing providers and new build developers. I started my career doing technical specifications in ventilation for things like condensation and mold. I then moved on to doing more technical specifications, but in this time for heat pumps. So essentially working very closely with new build developers to hold their hand through moving away from gas boilers onto more carbon-friendly technologies such as heat pumps, to where I am today, where I sort of specialize in heat networks, more specifically the operation and maintenance of heat networks, as well as things like reviewing the network operating efficiencies and general improvement works, and things like today, of course, like training on best practice. So a brief introduction of Insite Energy. The company has been providing services for heat networks since 2009. We first launched as a metering and billing provider with the key aim to lead the sector in providing customers with outstanding service. We can now proudly say this is what we are known for, having just gone over 3,000 Trustpilot reviews directly from the residents that we serve, with an excellent overall rating, which, believe me, while working in the energy sector during a giant fuel price inflation and a cost of living crisis and all the stress and worry that comes with it, is no small feat. Since our humble beginnings, we've grown rapidly, and we now support our clients by providing all aspects of heat network services, including full network maintenance, end-to-end management, and we now stand as one of the biggest providers in the sector. Right. So to begin, I think it's important to give some context and understand how we've got to where we are now and why heat networks are being more commonly discussed and utilised across residential developments. If we cast our minds back, a lot of what we're doing and discussing today can be traced back to the Climate Change Act of 2008. This act made us the first major industrialised nation in the world to set net zero into law. The main end goal of this act was that by 2050, as a country, we needed to achieve net zero carbon. It is a clear and simple goal, but it is deeply embedded with complexities and challenges that require massive change. When reviewing all aspects of our nation's carbon footprint, one of the biggest carbon emitters, and this should come as no surprise, is the production of space heating and hot water. Meaning that tackling the way in which we produce heating and hot water will have a drastic impact on our overall carbon production. Since then, as you'll have seen, there has been a requirement for an increase and improvement of renewable technologies, such as heat pumps being heavily promoted, even making mainstream news now. While we still find ourselves in a state of flux amongst new technologies, what is obvious to those in the sector is that gone are the days where one size fits all. So for many years, domestic gas boilers, as you will be aware, have made up the vast majority of heating and hot water supply. And we now find ourselves at a crossroad where this technology will either have to adapt or be phased out in place of a variety of new technologies to suit different housing needs. And this is where heat networks come in. Heat networks will play a key part amongst those solutions. The main reason being is that heat networks are far more upgradable and versatile when compared to each dwelling having their own boiler or electric radiators. If you design a development with a network, more specifically a heat network, it means that you will have a central source that provides heat for a whole block or an entire region. A heat source that can be made up of a variety of technologies, and something which is far easier to adapt and be upgraded to more efficient and lower carbon technology over its lifespan with fairly minimal disruption to residents. For example, if you try and replace 100 gas boilers across 100 different flats, it's a lot harder than replacing just one central communal boiler with an air source heat pump, for example. Currently, this technology is fairly common, placed across London and a lot of other European countries. London specifically, this is due to the London Plan. However, they are quickly appearing across the nation. You may be aware that they are cropping up in cities all across the country. Currently, heat networks make up roughly 3% of the total heat demand across the UK. However, aligned with our net zero plan, this is estimated to increase to around 20% by 2050, which means that a large development in investment and skills upgrades will be required, with many people becoming involved in heat networks for the first time over the coming years, if they aren't already. So essentially, if you work in and around housing, especially city centres, and you're starting to learn about heat networks early, will be time well spent, because if you aren't already involved now, it will be coming soon. So hopefully that sets the scene for why heat networks are being discussed, the importance of the technology in meeting our carbon targets, as well as the expected increase over the coming years. Now let's look at what they actually are and how they work. In its simplest definition, a heat network can be defined as any system that supplies thermal energy to more than one end user. The graphic you can see here has been created to show the constant cycle of a heat network in its simplest forms. So let's talk through it. Typically, this is the most typical setup for a heat network, where you'll have a plant room at the base of a building with a variety of heat network assets. But for simplicity, let's just stick with gas boilers. Typically, what you'll find is you'll have a large gas boiler at the base of the block, and that gas boiler's job is to produce heat into a hot water loop. That hot water loop is then pumped through giant pumps, typically in the plant room again, around the block in a giant loop, and then is brought back into the plant room later at a cooler temperature. As the hot water is generated in the plant room and is then pumped up through the building, each individual resident will typically have what's called a HIU, or a heat interface unit. I'll discuss this more later, so don't worry for the time being. The heat interface unit will absorb heat from that loop and use it to generate heating and hot water in that individual dwelling. Each HIU typically will have a heat meter, which is monitoring the heat that each resident has used. As the residents use the heat from this loop, the cooler temperature is brought back to the plant room to be reheated again and then sent back out. And it's this constant loop that a heat network does, where it heats water at a central source, pumps across a building, heat is then used by each individual dwelling, and then the cooler water is returned to be heated again. There can be a massive variety in technologies that do this, a massive variety in network efficiencies, but in its core essence, this is essentially how all heat networks work. I hope that makes sense, but we'll cover it more in a little bit more detail shortly. Sometimes when discussing heat networks, it can be a little bit confusing because heat networks are actually an umbrella term. When people say heat networks, they can either be talking about communal heating or district heating. Communal heating and district heating are similar, but it's also really important for you to understand the differences between the two. Communal heating is by far the most common type of heat network that you'll come across in the UK, and it's what most people will be referring to when talking about a heat network. It's usually made up from a centralized plant room at the base of a block of flats, and it provides heating and sometimes cooling to individual units in a block of apartments. The plant room equipment, as I've mentioned, can be made up of a variety of technologies. Typically, to date, the vast majority are still gas boilers. However, on new build developments or newer developments that are coming through at least, you'll find air source heat pumps being more readily used, ground source heat pumps being more readily used, and as well as cooling in sort of higher end developments. The demand for cooling is increasing far faster than the demand for heating, so cooling is also becoming far more common. This is all happening at plant room level. It's pumped through the building, as I mentioned on the previous slide, and then in each individual residential dwelling, you'll typically have a HIU for heating, a heat interface unit, or you'll have a CIU for cooling, a cooling interface unit, each with their own heat meter. So that is the most typical setup for a communal heat network, and what you'll see most commonly across the UK wide market. Larger scale systems such as district heat networks are less common. However, they are quite prevalent, especially in towns outside of London and across the UK. They're cropping up more and more often. These systems can provide heating not just to one block or two blocks, they can provide it to an entire area or region, an entire town. It usually utilizes a regional heat source, such as industrial waste heat, commercial waste heat, or renewable sources. Examples of this can be, there's lots of discussion, as you may be aware, of using waste heat from the London Underground. If any of you have been on the London Underground recently, you can see where that heat is coming from and where it could be used. And in the northeast, for example, there's lots of empty mines where they're filled with mine water. They're using the heat from those mines to pump up to the surface, to be used in a water source heat pump, and then it generates heat for a large area, commercial buildings as well as residential. And these big district heating systems can go in phases. So you can have phase one, which would cover a certain area, and then it can be extended to cover phase two, phase three, phase four, and just keep on getting bigger and bigger as long as the heat demand is there. Some of the systems that are in place across the UK are nothing but engineering brilliance for district heat networks. However, as mentioned, it's far less common. The irony is that typically when you talk about heat networks, people will think you're talking about a district heating network, when in most cases, it's a communal heating system. In terms of the plant room equipment, what you'll see will be there'll be very little difference from a communal heating system. You'll have a plate heat exchanger, which will be used to take heat from that central loop that's coming from the energy center. You'll also have thermal stores and then any other typical plant room equipment that you'll find. In terms of what the residents see from a domestic point of view, it's exactly the same. Typically, they will have a heat interface unit or a cooling interface unit and a heat meter or a cooling meter. A resident will likely be unaware if they're on a district or communal heating network. To be honest, most residents might be unaware that they're on a heat network at all. So long as when they turn on the radiators, run a shower or a bath, or as long as when they turn those on, hot water flows, you'll often find it's not often questioned where it came from. But I hope that makes it clear the differences between the two networks. The slide here shows a very typical setup for how a heat network is managed and the responsibility structure. So usually you'll have a client. The client can be a housing association or a council or a developer. They will then employ a managing agent. And a managing agent, as you're probably all aware, has a vast variety of tasks that fall under their remit in terms of responsibilities. These tasks can include things like waste management, legal and compliance, grounds management, and here's just a few. However, if the development includes a heat network, that also falls under the responsibility of the managing agent typically to manage. From our experience dealing with managing agents, heat network management can be a real headache and a pain for them to manage. The reason being is it's a very technical asset, and it's imperative to make sure that heating and hot water is being provided to the residents. It's a headache, but it doesn't have to be. And I'll talk you through the sort of key contracts now so you can clearly understand the main remits that you need to be focusing on when you're looking at management of your heat network. So we've broken management of heat networks down to these 3 contracts, and these are the ones that I really want you to sort of take home and get your heads around. So those 3, going from left to right and up to the top, is you'll have a metering and billing contract, you'll have a maintenance contract, you have an ESCO manager contract, or management contract if you prefer to call it that. And let's sort of delve into this a little bit deeper and understand the responsibilities of those 3 contracts. So within the metering and billing contract, the key responsibility here is to meter and bill the residents of the development and collect payments so that the gas or energy bill can be paid. Because bear in mind that the residents are not paying the gas bill, they're paying a heat bill. And the heat bill is then applied to the residents, funds are collected so that the gas bill can be paid. In addition, they can cover heat tariff setting, so they can calculate the heat tariff setting for you, and you can then instruct the heat tariff to be applied. They can also review service level reporting. They will be speaking and dealing directly with your residents. So it is important that whoever you pick or select to go into contract for a metering and billing contract, you select them carefully and ensure that your residents will receive a service that they're happy with. And it's an important point to note here. It's important to understand that the metering and billing provider is not typically responsible for the metering equipment being used. A good way to think of this is like a mobile phone and a phone provider. As an example, EE provides a mobile service, but they are not responsible for your phone. If your phone breaks, it will need to be repaired so that EE can continue to provide your service. It's very similar with the metering and billing contract in most cases. The metering and billing provider is there to provide a metering and billing service through the hardware within the building, whether that be the metering infrastructure or the metering equipment, but they're not typically responsible for the metering infrastructure itself. Which brings me on nicely to maintenance. Maintenance of your network is key to ensuring you have the best possible operating efficiency, as well as the longest life expectancy of your assets. A heat network, as mentioned, it is a very expensive asset, and it often includes many specialist pieces of equipment. And it's essential that you do not employ a standard plumber to work on these assets, as it can be the quickest way to kill efficiencies, drive up costs of heat, and turn the network into a sinkhole for funds. Working with an experienced and specialist maintenance provider will save you a lot of money and time over the years. A really common trope that we find is that you will work with a maintenance contractor who has little to no experience of heat networks, however has 20, 30, 40 years experience as a plumber. The skills at times are transferable, but in many cases aren't. And you'll quickly find that if you have a poor maintenance provider providing operation and maintenance of your system, the network efficiency will quickly drop. And then who typically pays for that is the residents, because their heat cost is going through the roof. So it's just something for you to really consider. Finally, you have management, or ESCO manager in some cases. This is typically the responsibility of the managing agent, and it includes full oversight of all heat network related contracts and financial management. So this also includes things like fuel procurement for the gas contract. Bear in mind what I've said earlier. You have a gas contract and you have a heat tariff. The gas tariff and the heat tariff are 2 separate things. The heat tariff is set after the gas contract is set. So it's important to understand those 2 differences. Much like metering and billing and maintenance, this can be outsourced to a third-party provider, and it's often preferable, as it means that all reporting and responsibility for heat network management is essentially brought under a central source. If you decide to manage the network yourself, it's essential that you work closely and have clear communication with the maintenance and metering and billing service providers. Otherwise, it can quickly turn into a lot of finger pointing and issues occurring without a clear understanding of who should have done what. So examples of this include, from our experience, gas tariff changes not being communicated with the metering and billing provider for the heat tariff. That is extremely common. So a gas tariff will be set by a managing agent or the ESCO manager, for example, if it's not then passed through to your metering and billing provider, and your heat tariff isn't changed in line with your gas tariff, you may quite quickly find that you're either over or under recovering of your residents, which is resulting in poor cash flow. Faulty meters not being reported or authorized and then fixed by the maintenance provider. Often the maintenance provider doesn't cover meters at all. So this is also a really common issue that you need to be aware of and keep close management of. If your meters are out of communication, your metering and billing provider will not be able to provide the service. If your maintenance contractor is not going to fix the meters, you need to ensure that you've got some sort of contract in place with a provider to ensure that if meters do go down, somebody can get out within a fixed SLA and get those meters fixed so that your metering and billing provider can continue to bill those residents accurately. These are only things for you to consider, and they're just a handful of things that can go wrong, but it's just issues that we've come across in our years of experience and some of the most common ones. The main point here is that you need to have a clear understanding of who provides what service and the costs associated with those services. That would go a long way to providing stable management and cash flow for your heat network. A good way to look at this would be to compare domestic metering versus network metering. The reason we do this is because most people really understand domestic metering, and when you compare it to heat network metering, you can quite quickly see the comparisons. So most homes in the UK will have a single gas boiler and a gas meter. Meter reads are then sent to the gas supplier manually or via a smart meter. Homeowners and gas suppliers are then responsible for the equipment and the communication, and this is all regulated by the Gas Act of 1986. However, heat network metering, homes have a HRU rather than the boiler. However, both look quite similar. Rather than a gas meter, you'll have a heat meter that's measuring the heat. Again, very similar. Meter reads are sent to the metering and billing provider rather than the gas supplier. The metering and billing provider will typically collect this meter data via a data logger that'll be in the plant room. And the data logger that's down in the plant room essentially collects and stores all the data from each of the individual heat meters in the properties. A router is then linked to the data logger on the site's local network, which can then connect that to the outside world via an ADSL line. It just means that your metering and billing provider doesn't have to physically go to the block to collect meters and meter data, which has happened in the past and in some older blocks still happens today. It's a good point to note here that best practice would be that you link that data logger with a 4G backup SIM card to ensure that communication is always available, because it can be quite often that the ADSL line can go down or the local network can go down. And if you have a 4G backup, it means that communication can constantly be provided to your service provider. Homeowners and heat suppliers are responsible for the equipment and communication within a network metering. And this is regulated by the Heat Network Metering and Billing Regulations of 2014. A common one that people discuss is heat suppliers and what a heat supplier is. So heat suppliers are often the managing agents or local authorities or housing associations, and in some cases the developer. It's important to understand that the metering and billing provider that you've selected, the maintenance provider that you've selected, or any other companies hired to help manage the heat network are typically not responsible for are not the responsible party for heating, hot water, or cooling supply. And it's just important to understand those differentiations. So if we look at domestic billing versus network billing again, just as sort of a quick roundup. On the domestic billing, you have a gas tariff, and it's made up of a unit rate, standing charges, and VAT. Network billing is much the same, except rather than a gas tariff, you've got a heat tariff, and it's broken down in exactly the same way: the unit rate, standing charges, VAT. Credit bills are paid exactly the same. They're a month in arrears, or quarterly, or bi-yearly. Same on network billing. And prepayment methods can be paid in almost exactly the same way as domestic billing. The main difference on domestic billing, should I say, is that regulations on domestic billing are far more robust than on heat networks, which I'll discuss in a few slides. Both charges are typically recovered via a daily standing charge, which is part of their tariff. I hope that's clear, and I hope that makes you really appreciate the difference between a gas tariff and a heat tariff, because it's one of the most confused points when discussing heat networks, especially amongst residents who don't understand why their heat tariff doesn't replicate a gas tariff in terms of cost. When it comes to specifying billing equipment, there are many on the market, and it's really good to have a clear understanding of what they do and don't offer. You can see a selection of some of them here with inclusions and exclusions. The main thing to understand is the difference between credit billing versus pay-as-you-go. So most people's immediate reaction when considering billing of a heat network is to go down the route of credit billing. This is typically because it's what we have in the domestic market, and it's also due to bad press that pay-as-you-go systems have had over the years. Credit billing is where residents are billed a month in arrears for their usage. Essentially, they use the heat and are then billed afterwards. Whereas pay-as-you-go, you're required to put credit on your account up front, and then as you use the heat, the credit is then deducted from your account. My personal advice would be that wherever possible, you should have pay-as-you-go hardware installed. The main reasons being are that if you have pay-as-you-go as an option and the infrastructure is there, it gives you much greater versatility over the lifespan of the development as you change tenure type to choose how you want to run the system, because pay-as-you-go can be run as a credit build system. You don't have to run it as a pay-as-you-go system. However, a credit build system can never be run as a pay-as-you-go system. So pay-as-you-go gives you far greater versatility than just running credit. And there are plenty of sites that we work on where we're asked to look at things like retrofitting pay-as-you-go systems, which just provides an extra level of complexity. So if you're at a stage where you're in the new stage of development, I always recommend that you put pay-as-you-go in as a standard upfront. Secondly, it provides much greater debt protection for you and for the residents. Obvious reasons being is that residents find it harder to get into debt. With a credit build site, if you bill a resident via credit and a resident either intentionally or unintentionally does not pay their bill, there'll be a shortfall in the funds collected from your metering and billing provider to pay back your gas contract. However, if you run a pay-as-you-go system, it means that debt protection is there for the residents, so they find it harder to get into debt. And additionally, cash flow is far greater improved for the development. Whichever billing method you decide on, you need to take transferability and open protocol into account. You want to ensure that you have the freedom to switch and choose between different metering and billing providers over the lifespan of the development. In truth, we could probably do a whole session on just this topic, but I hope that covers at least the essentials. You can also download our mini guide, which gives you a sort of greater in-depth of what we just discussed. So some considerations. I won't go through all of these because we'll send you the slides afterwards. There's also a quiz that you can take here from our website, but a few of the main ones really. You need to really have a clear understanding of what is specified and what is currently installed. You need to understand what is your preferred billing strategy. Is it pay-as-you-go or credit? Does the network infrastructure support the choice that you've made? And do you want a consumer interface? When I say consumer interface, some pay-as-you-go systems will have an in-home display that'll be mounted on their wall, which will show their balance. Others will have a purely app-based solution. Others will have nothing at all. It's these decisions that you need to make about what your residents choose and how your residents are billed. So on to maintenance. How does domestic maintenance and network maintenance differ? Well, with domestic maintenance, essentially everything falls down to the homeowner or the landlord of the property. So hopefully the boiler lasts between 10 and 15 years, after which they need to be replaced. An annual boiler will need a service will need to be done annually on a boiler. Breakdowns and repairs will be covered by the homeowner or the landlord. And payment methods are consumer direct to the plumber, so you're paying it straight out of your bank account. How that compares to network maintenance is slightly different. Residents of a heat network don't have the luxury of choosing, typically, their network maintenance provider. So it's imperative that whoever the managing agent is, or whoever selected the maintenance company, has selected their maintenance company carefully. HIUs typically will need servicing every 1 to 2 years as best practice, rather than every year like a domestic boiler. This depends on the model and manufacturer. And annual plant maintenance is essential. This includes servicing of all your heat assets and water quality checks. When I often say water quality checks, sometimes people think I'm talking about the cold water system. Obviously, that's imperative as well. But the thing that's often overlooked is the low temperature hot water, the water that's going through your plant room. If that isn't serviced and tested and checked regularly, you'll quickly find that the water is degrading your heat assets. It's just an important aspect that is often overlooked. The payment method for heat network maintenance is typically recovered via the service charge or the daily standing charge, however, far more common in the service charge for maintenance. So some maintenance considerations. Is the HIU covered by the freeholder, leaseholder, or tenant? This will typically all come down to the lease agreement that you've got in place. My recommendation would be that a HIU should be covered by the same maintenance contractor that's covering your plant room. The reason being is because a HIU is connected to your heat network. The clue's in the name, it's a heat network. You want to make sure that the same maintenance contractor that is maintaining your plant room is also maintaining your HIUs. This will maximize efficiency across the development. From our experience, where HIUs are the demise responsibility of the residents, they often don't get serviced or are serviced completely out of sync with the rest. You want to ensure that servicing and setup of all of your HIUs is completely aligned across your development to maximize efficiency. It only takes a couple of poorly performing HIUs or non-service HIUs to kill the efficiency of a development, which then means the rest of the residents pay a higher heat cost because the efficiency is lower. What is the ongoing management strategy for the heat network, and what experience do your heat network engineers have? And I would really be asking that of your heat network maintenance providers. What experience do you specifically have with heat networks, especially on residential developments? Because it's a very different skill set. And finally, when was your last efficiency review done? Efficiency reviews need to be checked at least every year. You should be checking the efficiency of your network and monitoring it closely. The majority of existing heat networks are estimated to operate at 35 to 45% efficiency, which is very poor, to be honest. What that essentially means is that for every pound that you pay in gas, only 35 to 45 pence of that is actually reaching your residents. The rest of it is bleeding out of your network. That can be through a majority of different means. There will always be a heat loss across the development or across the heat network. However, in the vast majority of cases, this can be quickly improved by close management and operation of a network. This can be done by things like changing settings or improving insulation. Management of domestic contracts is very simple. Fuel procurement is down to the homeowner. You can go compare and find the best gas rate. Finding a plumber or repairs, again, is up to you. And budgeting is down to you again. However, with the network, the slight difference here is fuel procurement, again, is out of the residents' hands, is in your hands. You need to make sure that you can find the best gas contract on the market. And that gas contract is communicated with your metering and billing provider to ensure that you can update your heat tariff accordingly. Plant room servicing and plant room repairs, again, are the responsibility of the managing agent or the ESCO manager in this case. Water quality testing, as I've said before, is imperative. Network servicing and network repairs are again covered by the managing agent. It's important to note that these responsibilities can be outsourced to various providers. You don't have to do this all alone. With ESCO manager considerations or management considerations in general, I'd say one of the key ones here is that do you have a sinking fund? And what I mean by a sinking fund is for your heat network assets specifically. And it's one of the most common things that people overlook. You have quite expensive equipment in your plant room, and they could go pop at any given time. What happens when that happens? Do you take a bridging loan? Where are those funds coming from? If you can factor in a sinking fund into your heat network management plan, what it means is that you can take stock of all of the assets in your plant room, work out a life cycle cost for those assets, and start putting a sinking fund in place accordingly, which softens those capital outlays as and when they come up. And do you have a clear breakdown of your profit and losses? Are you tracking heat network related contracts closely? These are all things that you really need to consider. But the sinking fund one, if out of any of them for a management, is something I would really pay attention to. Finally, I'll lightly touch on heat network regulations. And I say lightly because currently heat network regulations are fairly light, but we'll give you a timeline of what is to come. We have a team that closely tracks the expected changes in heat network regulations and does a really great work of digesting and breaking it down into easy to understand documents. So if you want more in-depth understanding of any of this, I can send further information at the end. However, I'll quickly run through the expected regulation changes that are coming down the tracks. So firstly, you've got consumer protection. The consultation for this ended in late 2023, and it's expected that by spring 2025, the first set of consumer protections will come in. And then by 2026, you'll have fully operational protections framework. Heat network zoning is incredibly popular. I see this talked about a lot, but essentially heat network zoning is that by designating zones where heat networks are expected to offer the lowest cost solution for decarbonising heat, local communities will have the tools to accelerate the development of heat networks, ensuring that more homes and businesses can access greener and cheaper heat. Consultation started at the end of 2023. You've then got technical standards, which is reviewing things like carbon emission limits and step-in arrangements. The second consultation took place early 2024, and we're still awaiting an update. Then you've got, as part of consumer protection, you've got pricing. So in 2025, it's expecting that you will need to provide Ofgem with data on tariffs, cost and profit information, and network efficiencies. And then by 2026, there will be a price investigation based on the first year of data. And this will help to set the price benchmarks and cost allocation rules. This will be things like proposed standing charges and proposed variable rates. Then also in 2025, you'll have the quality of service, and there'll be a complaints handling and energy ombudsman, as well as consumer advocacy bodies to become available to heat network customers. And then by 2026, there should be a guaranteed standard of performance. You'll also have a Vulnerable Consumer Protection Act coming in by 2025 as part of consumer protection. And there will be information to consumers during residency. So this will be a bill of transparency, essentially, and a bill of frequency, price change notifications, heat supply contracts, and limits on things like back billing. You'll also have a, I've jumped ahead of myself, sorry. Metering. So by 2025, there will be a modification to the heat network metering and billing regulations, and this will be to encourage further installment of smart meters and better utilizations of data. Like many industries, we have a lot of data, but we don't really seem to do a lot with it. And then finally, you'll have step-in arrangements in 2025. This will be things like looking at the circumstances for requiring step-in arrangements to be identified. I've talked a lot there, but the main point to take away here is that while regulations are currently limited, they are on the horizon and are currently being discussed and ironed out, with the majority expected to take effect by 2025. So it's just good to be aware of what's coming down the track. So finally, what are the key takeaways from this session and sort of things that I hope you've learned? Firstly, heat networks. Heat networks are a key technology in the future of heating and hot water, and they really will pave the way to net zero. And they're here to stay, and they're going to be a lot more common in the future. So if you're not involved in them now, you'll be expected to be involved in the future. The three key contracts that you should consider when you're looking at maintenance, when you're looking at management of heat networks, should be your metering and billing contract, your maintenance contract, and your ESCO manager or management contract, and who's providing those three services. And I suppose finally on regulations, for the time being, it's just a case of if you fail to prepare, you'll be preparing to fail. So just be aware of what those regulations are. And again, if you want any further information on the regulations and where they're at to date, we can provide you with further information after this session. That's all the talking from me in terms of presentation and information. Sort of over to you if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask or anything they'd like to discuss. I can see a question here. If we fail to register a building under the EBDS, are we too late to do so? I will double check and let you know and come back to you on that one, because the EBDS, you might well be, but I'll double check and get back to you on that one. You might well be. Any further questions from anybody else on what we've discussed so far? Um,
No,
well,
nothing
I hope
else
you found
coming in at the moment.
I hope you found that useful. But if there are any questions after the session, please do let me know.
Okay, thank you, Jarrad. That was great. Yeah, as Jarrad said, if you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with him directly or send the questions to me and I will pass them on. I will have a copy of the slides which we'll be able to share with you if you would like to have a copy. And the recording will be live on our YouTube if anyone wants to watch anything back over it again. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Jarrad, for your time this afternoon. And if you want to join us for any of our other webinars, we've got quite a packed schedule in June. So have a look on the News on the Block website and you'll be able to register there. Thank you very much and have a good rest of your day. Bye.